Okay, part 2 of the January Chat and Shit series. Bit late because of the because of the move rebalance. I thought I'd give it time to settle just to see if there was any major changes. So I'll sort of go into that a little bit at the end, but I don't think much has changed personally, but I'll go into that a bit more at the end. But yeah, wanted to make sure nothing drastically changed before doing this. But yeah, other than that, let's get into it. So type effectiveness, as I spoke about last time, is a sort of fundamental of Pokemon. Like ultimately, everything needs something that beats it, and everything needs to beat something else. Otherwise, you know, if something has something that doesn't beat it, it's broken. You know, there's no reason not to use it. And if something doesn't beat something else, there is no reason to use it. So everything's got to have something to beat it. And this is the reason the Mud Boys are so good. It's very hard to hit them super effectively because they've only got the one. They've only got the one weakness to grass. And it's very hard to resist all their moves as well because they have Sludge Wave, Blizzard, Stone Edge as coverage. I mean, Gastrodon's a bit different, but it's a different type of mon, isn't it, in that sense? You know, Politoed now we can add to that list as Blizzard. Yes, they're very hard to hit super effectively and resist everything they have. Things like Venusaur, Meganium, Shiftry, Ferrothorn, they have to swap in really quickly if they want to avoid taking a big hit. So Niantic's given us a bit of a nuclear option to deal with these beasts in Razor Leaf. In a vacuum, the Mud Boys are sort of like they're some of the best things in the game because, as we see here, water and ground, they only share the one weakness, which is grass. So it makes sense that you'd see a lot of grass in GBL to counter that. And particularly the Razor Leafers, because as I say, those things like Venusaur, Meganium, Shiftry, they have to be quick. Razor Leafers don't have to worry quite so much. But Sylphs is a little different. Because there are other things that beat Razor Leafers, that beat the Mud Boys. Generally speaking, things like Lapras and Dewgong beat them. Other bulky stuff beats them. And crucially, before any given game, you know whether there's a chance that you're going to face one or not. And that's really important because personally, I feel like the Mud Boys are much less threatening if I know I'm going to face them because I can prepare for that. And with that reduced threat comes, I feel like I don't have to try and hard counter them so much. You know, I don't necessarily have to try and use a Razor Leafer to counter them. I can try and go with something a bit softer that might pick up a few more wins elsewhere. That said, having a Razor Leafer in your 6, it might stop people bringing Mud Boys completely. So there's very much there's the appeal there of that. But personally, in a tournament setting, I see a Razor Leafer as a sort of nuclear deterrent sort of thing. I think I've done a lot of tournaments down the years, and I think if I remember rightly, I've only ever used Razor Leaf in Timeless Cup. Yeah, I may have used it once in early Tempest with Tropius, but quite honestly, I can't remember that whether I used Razor Leaf or Air Slash. So I'm not saying there's not a place, and there certainly is a place for Razor Leaf. I think if Razor Leaf didn't exist, if it wasn't a thing, Mud Boys would be broken. And that's why I think this the Razor Leaf nerf was such an interesting one because it was 11 and it's gone to 10. I think we probably could have dropped it down to 8, and it still would have served its function. I don't think the nerf, I mean, generally it can't. Generally the nerf is good. Of course the nerf is good, but on a attack-weighted Shadow Vic, it's still beating things like Frostlass and Blaziken in the ones, which is why the problem with Razor Leaf and Shadow Vic sort of lies, in my opinion, because the beauty of Sylph is that you can use different things every month, and there's reason to use different things, and because different things, it changes what's good every month. And things like Frostlass and Blaziken, where using them in GBL is probably not a good idea. I don't know, but I'm not great at GBL. Yeah, it's probably not a great idea to use them in GBL, but it can be devastating in Sylph. But having something that, by all logic, should lose to it, that beats it in the one shield is just, it's just too oppressive in my opinion. Fine, beat it in 2s, that's fine. You've got a high damage fast move. It makes sense that you should be able to do that. But the 1s, I still think it's a little too powerful. But sorry, I went on a bit of a tangent there. But as I was saying, it's there as a deterrent, and what I think is interesting is that I'd rather have in a tournament setting, I'd rather have a Venusaur, a Ferrothorn, and a Shiftry that has that extra versatility, because I know that there'll be people there that do have Razor Leaf, and I think Nightfall's a really good example of this, because people knew that there was going to be a lot of Razor Leaf and certainly a lot of grass. It made the Swamperts much less common than you might have thought initially, looking at the meta, because Shadow Vic and Razor Leaf is so oppressive versus them, and it'll likely end the game. If you've got if you end up with your Mudboy versus the Shadow Vic, unless you've got a really good Shadow Vic counter, there's very little chance of you getting back into that game. So with that in mind, knowing that A, other people will be running Razor Leaf, B, less people will be running Mudboys because they know people will be running Razor Leaf, that makes, in my mind, the grasses that beat the Razor Leafers and have much more versatility, that makes them far superior in Sylph to the Razor Leafers in my mind. I think there are caveats. There's not ever 100% of a statement, is it? It's not ever 100% true. Sometimes the typing or the utility moves that the Razor Leafers have can flip that. I think we saw Whimsicott, because of the fairy typing, in Marsh Cup do really well, although that was Charm, because he had Charm, not Razor Leaf, I guess. But you see things like Razor Leaf, a Cherim from time to time with Weather Ball, which can be useful. I think you could probably see a Razor Leaf for Bomber Snow from time to time, although Powder Snow with Weather Ball is so good that I think it's going to be less and less common, but it's still there as an option. And similar things with Ludicolo, where the typing is potentially enough to beat things, and the charge moves are fairly versatile. So it's not always a hard and true statement, but generally speaking, I'd much prefer using a versatile one. Now, if everyone started doing that, there comes a point where Mudboys start becoming more and more popular, and at that point Razor Leafers start becoming more necessary again. So there's certainly a balance. there's certainly a balance to this. But yeah, that's how I feel about Razor Leaf in Sylph. But there's other things that only have one weakness. A Sableye comes to mind, and only weak to Fairy. The only Fairy damage, the only Fairy fast move is Charm, and Fairies. I'll come on to Fairies in a bit, but the better examples of this are things with one weakness are the Bug Steals, only weak to Fire. You think of things like Wormadam, Escavalier, Genesect, Fortress, and arguably this bunch of Pokemon is a more versatile bunch in terms of what they can do individually than the Mud Boys. But why doesn't that make every team like run a big fire hitting option? Why aren't we seeing Incinerate becoming mandatory on every team? But I think the difference here is that they have a lot of stuff that beats them generally. First of all, we have Marowak, which is just good in general. It's really versatile because of the Shadow Ball and Shadow Bone, and it's fairly bulky. Then the Mud Boys generally beat them. The counter users generally beat them. The Flyers generally beat them. But between them being less spammy than the Mud Boys, and them having the sort of natural pairings of their moves being less good overall in terms of coverage, they're not quite as universally good at taking things on as the Mud Boys. So I think that's a key difference there between the Mud Boys and the Bug Fires. So going back to Charm and the Fairy typing, now this is where I think it's a bit different, because Dragon types Dragon was originally only resisted by Steel, and Steel doesn't hit it back super effectively. It was only weak to Ice and Dragon. Ice doesn't resist Dragon, and Dragon is super effective on Dragon. So really, Dragon was very hard to counter as well before the introduction of Fairy typing, which came along in Gen 6, I think. Gen 6, I think is right, maybe Gen 7. Either way, it wasn't there. It hasn't been there for very long, all things considered. So the problem that the game had in terms of balance was that Dragon types that were sort of generally countered by Steel and Ice. Steel and Ice have a lot of shared weakness as well. They're weak to fighting and weak to fire. And certainly in the context of Pokemon Go, fighting is an amazing offensive type because counter's so good. You have things like Cross Chop, which are nice and spammy. You have things like Dynamic Punch, which hit really hard. You have Power Up Punch. So you close combat, which is just monstrous. And then fire as well. As we just spoke about, AWAC being really good, really versatile, and there's other options there as well, but AWAC's the big one. Dragon needed another counter, another way of dealing with it, and Fairy does that because Fairy does it well, because not only does Fairy beat Dragon, but it beats the things that the other Dragon counters deal with. The fighting types being the main one. I mean, it's less the case with Fire, but we know the Wigglytuff matchup isn't terrible versus Marowak as well. So there's ways around it there. And also we have Steel types that can be Fire types as well. We have things like Bastodon and Probopass and Polio. Even the Ice types, Frostlass has the Shadow Ball to hit Marowak hard as well. So the fire is less of an issue than the fighting is. So it's important that Fairy type is good. Otherwise it stops Dragon, and otherwise Dragon and Fighting can become just ridiculously good, even more so than they already are. But with that comes the same problem as Razor Leaf. You know, we only have the one charge move with Fairy, so there isn't the option to change up a Charmer for something like a Venusaur or whatever you might run instead with the Grass type. And when you look at things like Gramble, which could potentially be useful with Snarl, or Togekiss, which could potentially be run with Wing Attack or Air Slash, that's what it gets. Gardevoir with the Confusion. All of a sudden, it stops doing what it's meant to do. You know, certainly in terms of the Dragon matchups, because Vilas is also there, which would make the Confusion Gardevoir struggle. Granbull maybe less so, but the bulk that Granbull doesn't have makes dealing with Altaria tricky. So I think you have to run a Fairy fast move, really, unless you're a super bulky Fairy like Azumarill. And that's why Azumarill's so good. It deals with all these things that I just mentioned. Steel, Dragon, Ice, Fighting, Fire. That's why Azumarill's so good, because of the typing. If Azumarill wasn't so good, well, the typing of the book. If Azumarill wasn't so good, I think that the meta would, the sort of Open Great League meta would look very, very different. I know it's changed a lot since GBL started, but I think it would have developed in a whole different direction, to be completely honest. But yeah, what I think is interesting is Galarian Rapidash, because between Psycho Cut, Body Slam, and Play Rough, I prefer Play Rough to Psychic because of Vilas. I mean, I know that's sort of nitpicky, but I think it's important that your Fairy beats all the dragons, to be honest. If you're running a Fairy, that's what you want. And, you know, generally speaking, Fairy and Psychic have different coverage, have broadly similar coverage. The Fairy's also giving you things like Obstagoon and Scrafty as well, so I think Play Rough, generally speaking, is what you'll want. But that combination of the fast charging Psycho Cut with their spammy Body Slam, I think gives you so much more versatility in the zeros and one shield matchups than you'll get from a Charm user. And I think if Rapidash was more bulky, it might have made some serious changes in the meta. As it stands, I still think it's a really good option, certainly in Sylph, purely because it does the job of a Fairy. On the whole, it does the job of a Fairy, without being locked into being a sort of two-shield specialist. And certainly the case with Wigglytuff, it's quite easy to wall because of the moves, which is why I've always been a big fan of Gramble, because it's much harder to wall than Wigglytuff. So I think that's something to look out for. But yeah, I think, and that's why I think it's, well, yeah, as I say, I think Charm has to be good, and it has to be very good, because it serves such a crucial role in the meta. If all of a sudden we start seeing more things with fast charging, with more Fairy types with fast charging moves like the Rapidash, then maybe at that point Charm could afford to be nerfed. But certainly, I think it's difficult to throw Charm and Razor Leaf in the same boat at the minute, because Razor Leaf has an alternative, Charm doesn't really. Yeah. So that's that, and I think that sort of leads on nicely to the next point, next thing we'll talk about, which is the importance of having good moves. You know, generally one of the reasons that Mudboys are so good is because of the typing, but also because they're really fast, and that in its own ways is quite oppressive. in a different way to how you might think of Charm and Razor Leaf, but it is quite oppressive. Yeah, and generally speaking, Pokemon can't be bulky and hit hard at the same time because of the way the stats work. You can't have high attack, defense, on HP. Like, there's got to be some give somewhere, otherwise you end up with a mon that's 4,000 CP in Master League. You know, you can't. You can't have that in Great League, really. So I've got a bit of a Venn diagram, and generally speaking, you know, things can fit well into one of these sections, whether they're bulky and oppressive, or bulky and fast, or fast and hit hard, or oppressive and hit hard. And you know, so I've picked sort of 4 examples there: Bastiodon, Umbreon, Shadow Swampert, and Shadow Vic. Now, personally, I always prefer things like Probopass to Basti. You know, these two mons have very similar matchups, broadly speaking. And while Bastiodon's in a league of its own in terms of its bulk, that extra bulk isn't helping you versus Mudboys or counter users. Certainly not, you know, when compared to Probopass. In actual fact, sometimes it might be doing you harm because you're giving them more chance to farm energy. And Probo's still a really bulky mon, and it wins its game while it wins its matchups whilst exerting more shield pressure than Bastiodon as well. So, sort of similar to the Shadow Vic Venusaur comparison a little bit, I guess. Has the versatility to land sort of thunderbolts on things like Poliwrath and Empoleon. Again, that's pretty self-specific. And I think, again, this is where we see the variation between Sylph and GBL, where something like Probopass wouldn't work in a Grasshole setup anywhere near as well as Bastiodon does, because the Grasshole setup is about making the most of the good matchups, whereas, in my opinion, the trick to Sylph is minimising the risks in bad matchups. So that's stuff like that's what I think there. And these sorts of inner sections, this is where I like looking for Pokemon, to be honest, because things that are sort of that they excel in one area, so like Hypno excels in its bulk, but it's a little bit oppressive and it's a little bit fast as well because of the moves. And Pokemon like Hypno, Probopass, Scrafty, and Shadow Gallade here, with the ones I've chosen, they excel in one area. And, you know, I've put Scrafty in oppressive because counter's really good, and the power punches even boost it even further. So if you wanted to double shield it, it could work in that same oppressive way as Basti and Shadow Vic. So they all have the one outstanding category. But the moves that they have there kind of bridge the gap between the other two. So like Gallade hits really hard, but because of the moves it has, it's also quite oppressive and quite fast. Same with Hypno, although it hits less hard, but it's just much more bulky. Probopass, as I say, is very bulky, very fast, and the moves it has are quite hard-hitting moves. So it's, you know, puts a bit more shield pressure on than Basti. And I think these sort of areas are where I like looking for mons, because as I say, these are the ones where I feel like you can minimise the bad matchups. Don't get me wrong, you can still be hard countered. Everything can be hard countered, as I was speaking about earlier. That's the whole point of the game. But these are the ones where the soft counters are going to struggle if you've got an energy advantage. And I guess what you're really looking for, or what I'm really looking for, is that sweet spot in the middle, which doesn't exist. Things that don't really do anything particularly well, but sometimes these can be the best safe switches. So sort of things I might say would fit better in the middle than anywhere else would be things like Lapras, things like a little Marowak, for example. Other than particularly hard counter in a particular matchup, I would struggle to describe in a word how you play Lapras or how you play Marowak. Whereas, as I say, with Umbreon, you can describe it as, oh, it's really bulky and it spams out foul plays or dark pulses or last resorts. Bastiodon, it's really bulky, you sit there tapping Smackdown, Swampert, frail as hell, but you hit really hard and you hit really fast, that sort of thing. Much more difficult to describe how things like Lapras and Marowak play. And I think I mentioned briefly the multipliers in the previous episode, and I think the fact that mons can generally fit in this sort of category of either fast or impressive, and they can't be both, or they struggle to be both unless they've got good moves. I think that shows that they've got the multipliers about right. The impressive moves like Razor Leaf and Charm, if the multipliers were sort of lower, so if the multipliers were higher, those moves would hit even harder, as would the spammy things like Swampert, they'd hit even harder. So things like Shiftry would be incredible, things like Swampert would be incredible. If the multipliers were lower, it goes the other way, and Bastiodon and Umbreon and Hypno become incredible because, and Azure gets even better because it then becomes impossible to take out these big tanky things unless you've got hard counters. So I think the fact that everything's equally viable shows that actually Niantic are doing a really good job with the balance of the game. And I think the nerf to Razor Leaf, as small as it was, I think that's testament to the fact that they get it. That's how I see it working. Yeah, the fact that these mons can be put into one place but not the other, it shows that they've got it right. Yeah, and I think that's the importance of moves. Generally things that you don't see in the meta. I remember when I first started playing Sylph, I was asking people that had played a couple of Sylph cults, like, oh, what do you think to this? Or what do you think to this? And they'd say, oh, yeah, it's all right, but it's not as good as this or whatever, which is fine. And I think the reason why generally things that we don't see as much aren't as good as the things we do is because they only fit into one of those categories. They only fit into one of fast, bulky, oppressive, or hits hard. They don't. Yeah, it's fine that they hit fast, but they're not bulky. They're either not bulky or they're not fast enough, or they're not hitting hard enough to justify being the fast. Not hitting hard enough to justify not being bulky, or they're not bulky enough to not justify not hitting very hard. That sort of thing. So I think that's probably why things that don't get used. Yeah, a bit of a rambly one, but yeah, I just think it's interesting because of the whole Razor Leaf Charm thing. I take the piss out of them a lot, but they are important. I think the Razor Leaf and Charm is where the distinction between Sylph and GBL perhaps becomes a bit more interesting. So I just thought I'd share my thoughts on that. Yeah. So I just realised I never spoke about the move changes. In the first part, I spoke a little bit about the main series games and compared the two a little. And generally speaking, I think PvP and the mains and in Pokemon Go and PvP and the main series games are very different things, fairly incompatible. So what I thought is, while I talk about the move changes, I'll show you this game that I had with Ryan v Tenacity the other night on a Pokemon Showdown, a simulator for the main series game thing. This game happened in real speed. It was a good one. It was the second one we had. The first one we had, he battered me with. He battered me in. So yeah, this is just something to play in the background while I'm talking about the move changes. And if you find that interesting, you can even pause. You can even mute me. Razor Leaf, I think, is the big one. As I say, it went from 11 to 10, didn't it? And I think it could have gone lower. I think it could have gone to 9, possibly even 8, and still served the function well. I think 10 is still too high. As I say, I think Shadow Vic can still beat, or an offensive Shadow Vic can still beat Frostlass and Blaziken and that sort of thing from a standing start. And I think that's important because what people look at is Sylph rankings. And ultimately, Shadow Vic still shows as a tick in the Sylph rankings versus things like Blaziken and Frostlass. So, yeah, personally, I don't think it's enough. I mean, what it's done is it makes Shadow Vic definitely the best Razor Leafer to do to use now, which is, I think what people were realizing anyway. But because I think the other Razor Leafers don't quite get there anymore. But given that that's the one that people use anyway, I don't really see the point in a nerf from 11 to 10. To be honest, I think 9 probably would have been about right. I think 9 to 8, 11 to 8 is a lot, and people could have been quite upset by that. So yeah, fair enough. I think 11 to 9 would have been better. The others I actually really like. Bubble, I know people say it's targeted at Azu, but I don't see a problem with that. I think it helps. I don't think it hurts Azu a great deal. Certainly not from Sims, but in terms of actually playing it, it might just hold it back just that little bit, which I think is possibly what it needed. Maybe it didn't. I don't know. I think it's probably a good thing to hold it back that little bit. Does it hurt other bubble users? Jellicent's just coming out. Jellicent is awesome, so I think nerfing bubble for Jellicent as well helps a little bit. But then other than that, what do we see with bubble? Ludicolo, Poliwrath. Poliwrath runs Mudshot anyway most of the time, so it's not a problem. Ludicolo, I think, wins games, generally speaking, by its unique typing and the set of resistances that comes with that, or that come with that. And the sort of nice coverage moves it gets, like Grass Ice coverage is nice with water damage. It's still a reasonably decent move, Bubble, in terms of damage. It's not like it's doing Thundershock or Mudshot damage. It's still going to be able to farm things down that are there to be farmed. So yeah, I like the Bubble nerf. I think the other nerfs, certainly Sky Attack and Rock Slide, I think were very good moves anyway. I don't think a minor nerf hurts them. It hurts a lot of good things in the meta by dropping them. Things like Noctowl, Altaria, G-Fisk, Skarmory, Machamp. But a lot of those moves weren't one-shotting Pokemon, unless they were weak to them anyway, in which case those matchups are still going to stay the same. A lot of those Pokemon get their wins by outlasting their opponent and hitting repeatedly, and they're still going to do that. So I don't think that's much of a problem. What else did we have? Shadowbone. I like the Shadowbone nerf. I think I personally stuck to Shadow Ball because I like the closing power of it, and I like it for the mirror a bit better as well. And I think just that drop in power might make people think about it a bit more. It might make Marowak play a little bit more diverse and a little bit more interesting. So I think that's a good thing. But what I think is really interesting is Crabhammer. I don't think it was enough, to be honest. I think we have super powerful moves like Blast Burn, Outrage. I think in order to have any risk of people using people using Crawdon and Kingler. I think it needed to be a super powerful move. I just see no problem if they boosted to 100 damage, to be honest. That said, I did use Crawdon in a few sets of GBL, and it's fun. It's really fun. By the time, if with Night Slash and Crabhammer, if you get a +2 boost, you're farming stuff down with Snarl. So it's very dangerous. But yeah, I think the Crabhammer buff is completely neither here nor there. But what I think is interesting is the Weather Ball being added to loads of things move pools. I think where the meta is becoming faster and faster, and activation time is becoming more and more important. And particularly giving it to Ninetales and Politoed. They're both quite bulky mons, sort of bulkier than average, really. Once you take away the big like stupidly tanky things like Scrafty and not Scrafty, Umbreon and Bastiodon it's very much on the upper end of the bulk spectrum. Ninetales and Politoed. And I wonder if this is, whether it's a purpose, whether it's something Niantic are doing on purpose to try and encourage people to use more charge moves, or I wonder if it's just to keep things fresh, because while on the face of it, nothing is completely, nothing new that we've had is going to change things completely overnight. Politoed's proven to be very popular, isn't it? Powder Snail, Alolan Ninetales is proven to be very popular. It just speeds up the metagame a lot, and yeah, I think we will see some long-term changes because of that. I think it makes sort of neutral safe swaps like Sableye a little bit worse, because there's more things now that you can't safe swap into, because if they choose to stay in, you're going to lose because you're going to be outspammed. Or if they swap Politoed in, for example, or an Alolan Ninetales, you might get outspammed, and there's more stuff they can do that now. So I think that's good. I think that's interesting. Yeah. So the third part will hopefully be out later this month. But until then, catch you later.